I still remember the way the porch light flickered the night I came home. Suitcase in hand, heart pounding for reasons I couldn't name. My mother hugged me like she was checking for damage. My father barely met my eyes, and the house smelled like fresh paint and secrets. I was just hoping for a little comfort, maybe a piece of my old life back. But the moment I reached for my bedroom door, my mother's voice cut through the silence, sharp, almost scared. Don't go in there. It was the first time I realized I wasn't really welcome in my own home anymore. If you've ever felt like a stranger in the place you grew up, you'll understand what happened next. Before I dive into my story, I'd really appreciate it if you could let me know where you're watching from in the comments. And if you'd consider subscribing to my channel, it would mean the world to me and help me keep sharing more stories like this. Thank you so much for being here. My name is Emily Carter, and the night I returned to my parents' house after nearly a decade away, the porch light flickered above me, casting a nervous shadow across the front steps. I stood there for a moment, suitcase in hand, listening to the distant hum of cicadas and the faint echo of a dog barking somewhere down the block. The air was thick with the scent of cut grass and something sharper, almost metallic, that I couldn't quite place. I hesitated, my hand hovering over the doorbell, before finally pressing it. My mother answered, her smile wide but brittle, as if she practiced it in the mirror. She hugged me, her arms stiff, her perfume overwhelming. "Emily, you look tired," she said, brushing a strand of hair from my face. My father appeared behind her, his hair grayer than I remembered, his eyes darting from me to the street and back again. He took my suitcase, grunting at the weight, and led me inside. The house was both familiar and strange. The walls had been repainted a pale blue, the family photos rearranged, and the old grandfather clock in the hallway had stopped ticking. I noticed a new security camera above the front door, its red light blinking steadily. My mother caught me looking and said, "Just for peace of mind. You never know these days." Her voice was light, but her eyes were wary. We sat in the kitchen, the table set for three. My mother asked about my job, my apartment in the city, whether I was eating enough. My father made a joke about my suitcase being heavy, and I forced a laugh, feeling the old ache of not quite belonging settle in my chest. I glanced down the hallway toward my old bedroom. The door closed tight, a new lock glinting on the handle. I didn't remember ever seeing a lock there before. After dinner, I stood up and said, "I'll just drop my bag in my room." My mother's voice cut through the air, sharper than I'd ever heard it. "Don't go in there. Emily, it's just storage now," my father added. "We had to clear out some space. You'll sleep in the guest room tonight." He tried to sound casual, but his voice was tight, and he wouldn't meet my eyes. I nodded, pretending not to care. But something in me twisted. My old room was the only place in that house that had ever felt like mine. And now it was off limits. No explanation, no warning, just a closed door and a new lock. The guest room was cold, the sheets stiff and smelling of bleach. There was no pillow, no lamp, and the closet was filled with boxes stacked to the ceiling. I sat on the edge of the bed, the springs creaking beneath me, and stared at the blank wall. Somewhere in the vents, something rattled, a metallic sound that set my teeth on edge. I tried to sleep, but every time I closed my eyes, I heard my mother's voice, "Don't go in there," echoing in my head. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, listening to the house settle around me. The wind rattled the window, and I pulled the thin blanket tighter around my shoulders. I thought about the last time I'd been home, years ago, for my grandmother's funeral. The house had been full of people then, voices echoing off the walls, the kitchen crowded with casseroles and coffee cups. Now it felt empty, hollow, as if something essential had been stripped away. Sometime after midnight, I got up, unable to shake the feeling that something was wrong. The house was silent, the only light coming from the street lamp outside, casting long shadows across the hallway. I crept toward my old room, my footsteps muffled by the thick carpet. The door was still locked, but as I reached for the handle, I noticed a small dark stain on the metal-dried blood. Or maybe just rust, but it made my heart race all the same. I pressed my ear to the door and listened. At first, there was nothing, just the hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. Then, faintly, I heard a sound scratching, desperate, like fingernails on wood. I stepped back, my breath catching in my throat. I told myself it was just a mouse, or maybe the house settling. But I couldn't shake the image of someone trapped inside, clawing at the door. I remembered, suddenly, the loose floorboard in the laundry room where my father used to hide spare keys. I tiptoed down the hallway, careful not to wake my parents, and knelt beside the washing machine. My hands shook as I pried at the board, half expecting to find nothing. But there it was, a new, unfamiliar key, wrapped in a child's drawing. The paper was yellowed with age, the crayon lines shaky and uncertain. On the back, in a scrawl I didn't recognize, were the words, "Help me." I stared at the drawing for a long moment, my mind racing. I didn't remember making it, but the handwriting was eerily familiar. I slipped the key into my pocket and crept back to my old room. The lock turned with a soft click, and I pushed the door open. Heart pounding. The room was stripped bare, the walls empty except for a single nail where my favorite poster used to hang. In the center of the floor was a large locked trunk, and beside it, a pile of old family photos torn in half. The air was thick with the smell of ammonia, sharp and chemical, making my eyes water. I knelt beside the trunk and ran my fingers over the lid. There was a padlock, but the key from the laundry room fit perfectly. Inside, I found a stack of medical files, each one stamped with my aunt's name, my mother's younger sister, who had disappeared years ago. Beneath the files was an old cell phone. The screen cracked but still working. I scrolled through the messages, my hands trembling, dozens of texts, all from the same number, all pleading for help. The dates stretched back years, long after my parents had told me my aunt was gone for good. At the bottom of the trunk was a flash drive. I plugged it into the phone and opened the only video file. The screen flickered, and I saw my parents. Younger, but unmistakable. Standing over my aunt as she sat at the desk in this very room. My mother's voice was cold, commanding, as she pushed a stack of papers toward her. My father hovered behind, arms crossed, his face set in a hard line. My aunt's hands shook as she signed the documents, her eyes darting to the camera as if she knew someone would watch this one day. I sat back on my heels, the weight of what I'd found pressing down on me. My parents had declared my aunt mentally unfit, taken control of her finances, and locked her away right here, in my old room. The scratching I'd heard was just a memory, but the evidence was real, undeniable. I closed the trunk and stood up, my legs unsteady. I wanted to confront my parents, to demand answers, but I knew it wouldn't matter. They would deny everything, twist the truth until I was the one who seemed crazy. I slipped the phone and the files into my bag and crept back to the guest room, my mind racing. The next morning, I sat at the kitchen table, the evidence burning a hole in my pocket. My mother poured coffee, her hand steady, her smile practiced. My father read the newspaper, his face hidden behind the headlines. I slid the phone across the table, the screen lighting up with the messages. My mother's face went pale, her lips pressed into a thin line. My father's fork clattered to the floor. They denied everything. Of course, my mother's voice was sharp, almost pleading. You don't understand. Emily, she was sick. We did what we had to do. My father stared at me, his eyes cold. You're making a mistake. I didn't argue. I just stood up, grabbed my bag, and walked out the front door. In the driveway, I called 911, my voice steady as I explained what I'd found. The dispatcher asked if I was safe, if I needed to wait somewhere else. I told her I'd be fine. My parents watched from the window, their faces masks of fury and fear. When the police arrived, my mother rushed outside, trying to snatch the phone from my hand. You're not my daughter anymore, she screamed, her voice raw with anger. The officers separated us, asking questions, taking statements. They searched the house, uncovering more evidence, hidden bank statements, forged signatures, letters from my aunt begging for help. My parents were arrested, handcuffed on the front lawn as the neighbors gathered, whispering behind their hands. I stood alone on the curb, my childhood home now a crime scene. A woman from next door approached me, her voice low. You did the right thing, Emily. You're not the only one. I nodded, too numb to speak. I watched as the police loaded boxes of evidence into their cars, the house growing emptier with each trip. I left town that afternoon, driving for hours until the city lights faded in the rearview mirror. I stayed with my aunt, who was living in a small apartment on the edge of town. She was thinner than I remembered, her hair streaked with gray, but her eyes were clear, her mind sharp. She hugged me tight, tears streaming down her face. Thank you, she whispered. I thought no one would ever believe me. We spent the next few weeks piecing together the story, going through the files, talking to lawyers and social workers. My parents were charged with fraud, abuse, and false imprisonment. The trial was public. The details splashed across the local news. My brother called, leaving angry voicemails, blaming me for tearing the family apart. I blocked his number, refusing to listen. 6 months later, my aunt was free, her name cleared, her life slowly returning to something like normal. We celebrated her birthday with a small party, just a few close friends and neighbors. I played the piano for her, the notes filling the room with a kind of peace I hadn't felt in years. My parents were under house arrest, their reputations ruined, their world reduced to the four walls they'd tried so hard to keep me out of. As I left the party that night, I found an envelope tucked under the windshield wiper of my car. Inside was a photograph, an old family portrait, my face carefully cut out. I stared at it for a long time, the edges of the paper soft and worn. I didn't feel anger or sadness, just a quiet certainty that I had done what needed to be done. The weeks after the trial felt strangely quiet, as if the world had exhaled and left me standing in the stillness. My aunt, whose name was Lila, began to reclaim her life in small, careful steps. She started each morning with a walk around the block, her cane tapping a steady rhythm on the sidewalk. Sometimes I joined her, and we would talk about nothing in particular, her favorite flowers, the neighbor's new puppy, the way the light changed in the afternoons. There was a gentleness to those mornings, a sense of possibility that I hadn't felt in years. I found a job at a local bookstore, shelving new arrivals and chatting with customers about novels and memoirs. The work was simple, grounding. I liked the way the paper felt in my hands, the smell of ink and dust, and the quiet hum of the old ceiling fan. Lila would visit sometimes, sitting in the corner with a cup of tea, watching me as I moved through the aisles. She never said much, but her presence was a comfort. At night, I would lie awake in the small guest room Lila had made up for me, listening to the sounds of the building settling, the distant laughter of neighbors through thin walls. Sometimes I dreamed of my parents' house, the locked door, the cold guest room, the way my mother's voice had sounded when she told me not to go in there. I would wake with my heart pounding, the memory of that night sharp and clear. One afternoon, as I was closing up the bookstore, a woman came in, her face familiar in a way that made my stomach twist. She introduced herself as Mrs. Harper, a neighbor from my parents' street. She looked at me with a mixture of pity and admiration. "I just wanted to say," she began, her voice low, "that what you did took courage. Not everyone would have done the same." She hesitated, glancing around the empty store. "You know, your parents, they always seem so perfect. But sometimes, the quietest houses have the loudest secrets." She squeezed my hand before leaving, and I stood there for a long time, her words weighing on me. Lila and I began to talk more openly about the past. She told me stories I'd never heard about her childhood with my mother, the way their parents had favored my mother, the small cruelties that had built up over the years. She described the day she was declared unfit, how she tried to fight but no one believed her. "It's a strange thing," she said one evening, her voice soft, "to be erased by your own family. You start to wonder if you ever really existed at all." I thought about my own childhood, the way I'd always felt like an afterthought, the way my parents had lavished attention on my older brother, Mark. He was the golden child, the one who could do no wrong. I remembered birthdays where my cake was an afterthought, school plays where my parents left at intermission, holidays where I was given practical gifts while Mark received everything he wanted. I learned early to make myself small, to disappear in plain sight. One day, I received a letter in the mail, the envelope addressed in my mother's careful handwriting. I hesitated before opening it, my hands trembling. Inside was a single sheet of paper, the words precise and cold. She wrote that I had betrayed the family, that I had destroyed everything they had worked for. She said I was no longer welcome in their home, that I was dead to them. There was no mention of Lila, no apology, no acknowledgement of what they had done. I read the letter twice, then folded it neatly and placed it in the back of my desk drawer. Lila found me sitting at the kitchen table that evening, the letter still weighing on my mind. She poured me a cup of tea and sat across from me, her hands wrapped around her mug. "You don't have to carry their anger," she said quietly. "You did what was right. Sometimes. That's all we can do." I nodded, but the ache in my chest lingered. As the months passed, I began to rebuild my life. I made new friends at the bookstore, joined a local writing group, started taking piano lessons again. Lila encouraged me, her pride evident in the way she clapped after each song. No matter how many mistakes I made, we hosted small dinners for her friends, the apartment filled with laughter and music for the first time in years. I felt a sense of belonging. But the past had a way of creeping back in. One evening, as I was locking up the bookstore, I saw Mark standing across the street, his hands shoved deep in his pockets. He looked older, tired, his shoulders hunched. He crossed the street and stopped a few feet away, his eyes searching mine. "Why did you do it?" "Emily," he asked, his voice barely above a whisper, "why did you have to ruin everything?" I took a deep breath, feeling the old fear rise in my throat. "I didn't ruin anything, Mark. I just told the truth." He shook his head, anger flashing in his eyes. "You could have kept quiet. You could have let it go." I looked at him, really looked at him, and saw the boy he used to be, the one who had always gotten what he wanted, the one who had never learned to question our parents. "I couldn't," I said simply. "Not this time." He turned and walked away, his footsteps echoing down the empty street. I watched him go, a strange mix of relief and sadness settling over me. I knew then that some wounds would never heal, that some families could not be put back together. Lila and I continued to move forward, building a new kind of family from the pieces we had left. We planted a small garden on the balcony, filling it with herbs and wildflowers. We adopted a stray cat, a scrappy gray tabby with a crooked tail, who quickly became the center of our little world. We celebrated holidays in our own way. Quiet dinners, homemade decorations, stories shared over candlelight. One afternoon, as I was watering the plants, I found another envelope tucked under the doormat. This one was unmarked, the paper thick and expensive. Inside was a photograph, another family portrait, this time with Lila's face scratched out. There was no note, no explanation. She showed it to Lila, who studied it for a moment before setting it aside. "They want us to feel alone," she said, "but we're not." The bookstore became a refuge, a place where I could lose myself in stories that were not my own. I started writing again, filling notebooks with memories and dreams, fragments of conversations, and half-remembered songs. Lila encouraged me to share my work at the writing group, and though my hands shook the first time I read aloud, the applause that followed was genuine, warm. As the first anniversary of the trial approached, I found myself thinking more about forgiveness, not for my parents, but for myself. I realized I had spent so much of my life trying to earn their love, their approval, that I had forgotten how to love myself. Lila helped me see that I was more than the sum of my family's mistakes, that I could choose my own path. On the night of the anniversary, Lila and I sat on the balcony, watching the city lights flicker in the distance. She reached over and took my hand, her grip strong despite the tremor in her fingers. "You saved me, Emily," she said softly. "You saved us both." I squeezed her hand, feeling the truth of her words settle deep in my bones. I don't know what the future holds. I don't know if I'll ever see my parents again, or if Mark will ever forgive me. But I do know this. I am not the same person who stood on that porch a year ago, suitcase in hand, heart full of hope and fear. I am stronger now, braver, more certain of who I am. Sometimes, late at night, I still dream of the locked door, the secrets hidden behind it. But when I wake, I am surrounded by the life I have built, the family I have chosen, and that, I think, is enough.